All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating document that bridges a massive gap. It basically looks at how foundational, ancient Christian teachings address the very modern, very real struggles of believers today. We are exploring the intersection of ancient biblical texts, the early church fathers, and the hyper-connected, honestly hypersexualized culture sitting right outside our front doors. It's a deep dive into what the source material presents as God's call to holiness in a corrupt generation.
Now, the source material immediately sets up this incredible parallel. We tend to think our modern temptations, stuff arriving straight into our pockets via smartphones, social media, infinite internet access, we think it's a totally brand new problem. But the text points out something crucial. Early Christians faced the exact same environmental pressures in the sexually permissive Roman Empire. So, the delivery technology? Yeah, that's completely evolved. But the fundamental human struggle against a culture of normalized immorality, that hasn't changed one bit.
Section 1. God's Design for Purity, the Biblical Foundation. Okay, so the text anchors its theology in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, focusing specifically on the Greek word porneia. The source defines this as encompassing literally every form of sexual activity outside of God's design for marriage. And what the text makes abundantly clear here is a major paradigm shift. The Apostle Paul didn't view purity as just some optional spiritual extra credit for the super religious. He presented it as God's definitive foundational will for a believer's sanctification. And this illustrates the remarkable continuity of the early church. Look at this quote from St. Polycarp, who, by the way, was incredibly a direct disciple of the Apostle John. He writes that young men must be caring above all for purity. The source highlights this to show how Polycarp echoes the apostles. He frames purity as a holistic way of life. It was never just about avoiding a public scandal, It was about maintaining a high internal standard of living, even when absolutely no one else was watching. The source then challenges our modern mindset by calling out a very common yet entirely flawed question: how far can I go without sinning? The text points out that so many young Christians ask this when they're testing their limits. They end up treating purity like a cliff edge. The goal becomes seeing just how dangerously close you can put your toes to the drop-off without technically falling over. It turns into a game of managing boundaries rather than actually pursuing health. But the text argues that the true biblical question believers should be asking themselves completely flips that script. Instead of asking how close you can get to the edge, the question becomes, how can I honor Christ with my body? That single shift changes the entire framework. It takes the focus totally off limit testing and rule skirting and directs it entirely toward active honoring and devotion.
Moving on to Section 2, the battle for the heart, confronting pornography. By citing the teachings of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, the text establishes a critical, undeniable principle here. Sexual sin begins internally, long before any physical action ever takes place. The real battleground isn't just your physical behavior or what you do with your hands. The primary, the most highly contested battleground, that's the human heart and the human mind. Now here is where the source material gets incredibly fascinating. St. John Chrysostom, writing literally centuries ago, states that the look becomes the beginning. The text points out that Chrysostom historically anticipated exactly what modern neuroscience now confirms about the human brain. I mean, long before brain scans even existed, he inherently understood that repeated visual exposure actively shapes human desire, literally training the mind and rewiring neural pathways toward impurity. It's wild. And because of that reality, the source warns that pornography is absolutely not just a private issue that affects no one else. The text argues it acts like a toxin with massive ripple effects. It actively degrades a person's relationship with God, sows seeds that negatively impact future marriages, severely limits your capacity for true sacrificial love, and ultimately dulls spiritual sensitivity. Actually, scratch the idea of it being private. It's a private habit with profound public and internal consequences. Section 3. Resisting cultural pressure, the mind versus the world. The text draws a really sharp contrast here between the prevailing messages of our time and scriptural mandates. Today's cultural narrative constantly preaches that sex before marriage is totally normal, that purity is just an unrealistic fantasy, and that your feelings should be the ultimate judge of your morality. But the text juxtaposes all of this with Romans 12:2, which mandates active resistance. Do not be conformed and be transformed. The explainer emphasizes that the Christian life is always required actively pushing back against the cultural current. To reinforce this, the text brings in St. Ignatius of Antioch, who writes, "Be not deceived with strange doctrines." The explainer uses this to show that believers have to actively prevent the surrounding world, whether that was a crowded Roman marketplace back then or our personalized social media algorithms today, from reshaping their core beliefs and conduct. The foundational question isn't what does the culture approve, but rather what pleases Christ.
Which brings us to Section 4, Boundaries in Dating, the Call to Flee. The crucial point here centers on a very specific aggressive verb used by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians, flee. The source points out that Paul doesn't advise managing temptation. He doesn't say, hey, negotiate with it, or let's see how strong your willpower is against it. I mean, you wouldn't try to negotiate with a burning building, right? No, he commands a complete, immediate retreat. The text argues that many fall simply because they refuse to run, sticking around in situations where temptation inevitably becomes overwhelming. Ignatius is referenced again here to emphasize the ultimate goal of these relationships. He writes that unions must be according to the Lord and not according to lust. The source uses this to explain that Christian relationships and marriages must fundamentally be guided by God's overarching purposes. In a modern dating culture driven entirely by uncontrolled human desires and rapid-fire swiping, this presents a radical, purpose-driven alternative. To actually put this into practice, the text provides these vital self-reflection questions for anyone evaluating a dating relationship. Ask yourself, does this dynamic help me grow closer to Christ? Do our physical boundaries actually honor God? Are we encouraging holiness in each other, or are we really just enabling temptation? It is a highly practical toolkit drawn straight from the text for navigating modern romance through an ancient biblical lens.
Section 5. Hope for those who have fallen. Grace and restoration.
So the source makes it exceptionally clear that while the biblical standard for purity is incredibly high, the gospel inherently offers an unbreakable safety net. 1 John 1:9 promises that there is complete forgiveness and restoration available for those who stumble. Hearing about a high standard often makes people dwell entirely on their past failures, but the text insists that profound grace is immediately available, right now. And this beautifully illustrates the historical consensus of the early church. Take this quote from Tertullian, God prefers the repentance of the sinner. The text points out a vital, delicate balance here. The early church never minimized the severity of sin, and they certainly didn't lower the standard. But, as Tertullian notes, they never, ever denied God's profound, expansive mercy either. The door back is always open. For anyone struggling with repeated failure, whether that's with pornography, fornication, or boundary issues, the text provides a clear, practical roadmap for returning to holiness. It's an active process. It begins with sincere repentance, moving out of isolation to seek real accountability, actively returning your focus to Christ, and then picking up the sword to continue the fight. It is a forward-moving process of relentless restoration. The core thesis of the source material ultimately culminates in this powerful idea. The exact same Christ who sustained the early church under the intense daily pressures of the Roman Empire is ready to sustain believers today. Why? Because purity is not simply the sterile, exhausting absence of sin. It is actively and dynamically a heart totally devoted to Christ. So let's end on this profound thought derived from the text. If purity isn't just some miserable checklist of things you're trying to avoid, how will you devote your heart to Christ today? How does shifting your focus from merely trying not to fail to actively pursuing a devoted relationship, how does that fundamentally change how you live your life tomorrow morning? It's a really powerful reframing question from the source material to carry with you as you navigate the modern world. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.